72 hours? Thorne Kalvik repeated with a low breath, jaw locking as his boots echoed against the deck plating of Ardent Reach Command. He stepped closer to the display, eyes narrowing on the incoming directive streaming across the chamber's primary tactical console. They've already moved. The operations bridge was a dome of silent scrutiny. The chamber's ambient lighting reacted to the feed, casting muted red streaks across glass-paneled walls, like blood filtering through clouds. Dozens of analysts stood frozen around their elevated stations, fingers twitching near manual overrides, yet none daring to break the growing pressure with speculation. The directive from the Dravari hegemony had just finished auto-translating, cold formalities embedded within diplomatic language, adorned with timestamps and the signature glyphs of a high military channel. Kalvik stepped forward. His right hand curled behind his back while his left tapped into the side of the command interface. The static-ridden loop of the ultimatum played once more, projected through the narrow beam of a display wedge mounted over the command circle. You are ordered to evacuate all Earth-lined assets from Ardent Reach. Territorial breach protocols have been violated. 72 hours. Compliance ensures peace, defiance ensures force. The Admiral didn't blink. His posture remained fixed, but the muscles beneath his uniform coiled. Navark Virik doesn't ask for peace, he muttered. Not unless it's already dead in his throat. Commander Jarek Dow, Kalvik's second in command, exhaled through gritted teeth and tilted his head toward the rear station. Run that timestamp against long-range transit data. Check cross-sector jump pings. I want verification on every Dravari capital signature from the last 30 cycles. A junior analyst at the far edge of the bridge, Lieutenant Avon Rawl, brought up a collision of data nodes with trembling fingers. Sir, cross-verification shows 6 Dravari fleets already accelerating toward Reach. Vectors aren't speculative. They're locked. Jump preps began at least 12 hours ago. Their cores are already spooling. Kalvik looked away from the screen and toward the reinforced window strips slicing the upper arc of the chamber. Beyond it, the stars of Ardent Reach blinked like flecks of shattered glass above a dormant lava field. Beautiful, but indifferent. His voice remained composed, but now had an undercurrent that drew attention like gravity. They gave us 72 hours, but their jump alignments hit terminal velocity 18 hours ago. This is not a warning. It's camouflage. Jarek's face darkened. You're saying this was a performance? I'm saying the war has already left its staging grounds. Kalvik turned toward the command table and activated a low-band relay. Get me Strategic Council, now. The Strategic Council interface unfolded inside a sealed chamber beneath the primary deck. The walls were insulated with sink-proofing mesh, and the table itself embedded with dead-zone recorders. 4 figures sat on screen, each bearing the emblems of different defense blocks: Deep Strategic Command, Infrastructure Logistics, Non-Linear Thread Management, and Earth's Diplomatic Enclave. Commander Kalvik, came the voice of Director Rian Maris from Strategic Threat Division. We've received the hegemony's demand. You're authorized to coordinate civilian evacuation assets and initiate comm silence protocols. They're not posturing, Kalvik interrupted, hand flat on the control board. Their battle groups are already en route. 6 confirmed fleets. Dreadnought signatures are embedded. This is a multi-vector push, not a test. Maris leaned forward. Are you implying the ultimatum was deployed with intent to mislead the Council? That the countdown was a mask for an already authorized strike? Kalvik's tone never rose, but his words dropped with weight. Not implying, confirming. The pause that followed felt heavy, like an entire chamber holding breath. Then another voice entered, cold, clipped, and spoken by Counselor Edrin Vallis. Dravari internal comms show conflict within their command strata. Our decrypt teams pulled secondary transmissions off their diplomatic relay bands 2 hours ago. The military wing acted independent of full Council consent. High Admiral Virik initiated the strike chain before consensus. This ultimatum was a shell for something unauthorized. They wanted the appearance of procedure, said Kalvik, but not the delay that comes with it. Which means, murmured Maris, any formal response from us legitimizes their timeline. Kalvik's eyes locked on the screen. Then we don't respond. Back on the bridge, Kalvik returned as the data overlays finished their sweep. The room's light had dimmed. Warning threads, red and amber, spidered across fleet movement maps. The tension was no longer silent. It vibrated in every breath, in every clenched jaw and paused hand. Lieutenant Rahl stood back from the nav panel, eyes flickering between Kalvik and the data prism hovering beside him. "Commander, what do we do?" Rahl asked, voice steadier than it should have been. Kalvik didn't hesitate. "We enact forward silence." The room fell still. Even Jarek looked up sharply. "Begin soft null on civilian nodes in the sector. Wipe all active transmissions from planetary relays. Redirect outbound traffic. Make it look like an evacuation panic. Push it wide and scattered across band layers." Kalvik turned, voice carrying without shouting. "Activate ghost cargo operations from Corridor E. Legacy codes only. No military markings." Jarek stepped beside him. "The merchant haulers. They haven't carried ordnance since the treaty accords." "They still don't," Kalvik replied. "But they carry enough phase disruption arrays to turn coordinated emergence into molecular soup. They won't see it coming." He turned toward the lower console deck. "Prep jump masks. Assign each ship civilian registry from 10 cycles back. Dead code IDs routed through the old diplomatic spine. They'll pass filtration." Jarek frowned. "It's a huge gamble. If they check registry layers, they won't. Dravari protocol relies on streamlined checks at transitional corridors. They'll trust what comes through the spine. They built the damn system." Kalvik placed both palms on the edge of the console and leaned in, as if grounding himself to the ship's spine. He closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them and nodded once. "We won't stop the attack. That clock's already broken. What we can do is intercept their war with one of our own. Not with more guns. With the collapse of sequence." The final command triggered. On screen, a fleet of 10 civilian haulers lit their drives and began curving toward jump initiation vectors. Their holds were cold, their walls thin. But each carried a device whose purpose was to unravel structural arrival protocols before the enemy could even finish rematerializing. "Turned out's fake," Kalvik muttered under his breath as he watched the registry lights blink out of local space. "So, we don't wait." And without a single declaration, Earth went silent. But it had never been more awake. The command to vanish was issued not with ceremony, but through a single line of code passed silently from Thorn Kalvik's console to the Earthside grid nexus. Seconds later, entire civilian communication trees inside Ardent Reach were extinguished without visible trace. From one node to the next, message chains collapsed mid-transfer. Weather stations froze on static. Colony emergency boards flashed garbled alerts and then went black. Relief signals were intercepted, rerouted, buried in manufactured echoes. Inside the command chamber, lights remained dimmed. The visual map stretched across the southern wall had gone dark, by design. Strategic overlays had been shut down, replaced by muted waveforms indicating internal lockouts. To the untrained eye, it resembled a catastrophic systems failure. But for the operators inside Reach Command, it meant the plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Kalvik's voice traveled across the chamber, low and controlled. "Begin sector fragmentation. Feed evacuation visuals into public bands. Use footage from the Savan Arc fires. Slow the frame rate, let it bleed like a live feed." Lieutenant Rahl didn't question. He keyed in the directive and launched the fabricated emergency broadcasts. Across interlinked platforms, panicked evacuation scenes began cycling. Cargo shuttles lifting off in disarray, static-drenched calls from colony mayors, distorted clips of children being ushered into shelters. The data was sourced from unrelated disaster drills, decades old. The edits were seamless. Javari protocol officers would scan these layers first, verify their metadata signatures, and mark them as confirmation. Earth was retreating. Kalvik watched the feed without blinking. Push it wide, every major comm route. They'll see the ghosts of a retreat and assume they triggered it. Comm overlays active. RAL confirmed. Wide frequency saturation begins in 90 seconds. Kalvik nodded once. Now, get me Vokar. Operations Officer Dren Vokar stood inside a shielded coordination dome orbiting the blackened edge of the carven wall, a sloped curtain of fractured gravitational ridges that ran the length of the sector's inner fault line. From this angle, Ardent Reach wasn't visible to the naked eye, but its gravitational shadow could be tracked through disruption telemetry pulsing along the dome's outer shell. Vokar's hands moved without hesitation across the angled terminal, each input dispatching orders to buried logistic arms and dormant field units waiting for release. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes remained locked on a vertical chart scrolling shipping manifests tied to legacy merchant vessels. Behind him, Logistics Director Harl Cern stepped closer, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of bureaucratic tedium, now weaponized into strategy. He studied the readouts and gave a slow exhale through his nostrils. 10 haulers, all from decommissioned trading fleets, civilian cargo tags dated to 2 treaties ago. No combat signatures, not a single traceable weapons pod. They'll clear the diplomatic corridors without challenge, Vokar replied, voice hard. Dravari sensor nets won't flag them. Their scanners are tuned to threat profiles, not internal structural anomalies. Cern ran a gloved hand across his temple, and inside each of them sits a lattice array meant to tear apart the anchor point of a fleet emergence cycle. He wasn't asking. Yes, Vokar confirmed, but only once triggered. Which they will be, Kalvik's voice rang in through the comm deck, now patched through in live sync. They won't arrive in time to adjust, their formations are tight, their window is narrow. They'll come in believing it's clean. And then? Cern asked, glancing toward the empty space outside the dome. Then they meet a sector where gravity doesn't finish forming, Kalvik replied, and find their fleet scattered before they can deploy a single order. Within the next hour, the merchant vessels began launching. Each departed from hidden docks along the lateral fringe of Ardent Reach. Their departure logs were injected into an outdated diplomatic clearance archive Earth hadn't used in 30 cycles. The haulers bore authentic wear, discoloration from prior re-entries, irregular hull scoring, carbon buildup on their exhaust ducts. Nothing had been polished, nothing digitally masked. The point was to be overlooked. From his command chair, Vokar monitored the hauler spread as it expanded into staggered arcs, each vessel taking a slightly skewed vector meant to mimic the typical slow drift of civilian trade traffic. Inside their cargo holds, however, the atmosphere was far from passive. Phase disruption lattice arrays, flat, nested structures composed of coiled gravitic bands, hummed within their chambers. Each was dormant, yet pulsing with latent distortion potential. No signal emitted from them, no energy spike, only a silent potential waiting to be triggered by fleet density above threshold. Cern stepped forward, folding his arms. There's a reason we lock those devices into vaults. They don't just fracture arrival routes, they rewrite what direction means. We're not using them to destroy, Vokar said. We're using them to fracture the concept of arrival itself. They'll land, just not all in the same moment, or the same location. Or the same timeline, Cern muttered, then crossed himself, out of old superstition. Vokar didn't respond. Instead, he activated the deep space relay and broadcast a burst of telemetry to Reach Command. Kalvik's face appeared once more on the left side of the primary screen, overlaid with the deployment map. Your field is active, Vokar reported. They'll pass inspection unless the hegemony reroutes a scout patrol within the next 30 minutes. They won't, Kalvik replied. They believe we're running. They'll move fast, trying to exploit the window before we regroup. They won't check corridors they think we're abandoning. The visual feed showed the modular haulers slipping quietly through intersystem drift, unremarkable, almost sluggish. But inside those anonymous frames rested a field of energy dense enough to corrupt arrival architecture for anything larger than a corvette. Kalvik turned away from the screen just as the last hauler entered transition fog. You have clearance to initiate passive grid interference. Keep the field non-reactive until primary fleet mass crosses into emergence phase. Timing has to be exact. Vokar nodded sharply. Understood. Once they enter sync band drift, our field will collapse their shadow alignments. They'll break apart before they can form. Kalvik's gaze settled on the darkened corner of the bridge, where the pulse data from each hauler scrolled like faint arterial rhythms. Remember, we're not here to erase them. We're here to unwrite the script they brought. He paused, then gave one final directive, cold as iron. Silence is active. Begin forward collapse. And far beyond Earth's visible hand, the future bent in ways the enemy had not prepared to calculate. The first ripple didn't look like an arrival. It looked like a rupture, subtle then catastrophic. Ardent Reach's central tracking station, embedded into a shielded observation ridge just above orbital plane, detected the distortion as a vertical tear through mapped gravity lattices. It didn't pulse like standard FTL exits. It wrenched. The shift in mass distribution occurred so violently that auto-correction systems inside the monitoring deck triggered seismic dampeners, normally reserved for asteroid strikes. Lieutenant Rawls' hands clamped both edges of the control station as tremors coursed through the floor beneath his boots. The spatial grid stuttered. A red fault line etched itself across the active monitoring screen as 7 objects began to stabilize. Halfway. They're not in sync, he muttered, throat tightening. Commander, they're not arriving clean. Kalvik stood behind him, eyes sharp, hands still. He made no move to intervene. Focus on emergence telemetry, ignore hull designations. Another object breached, only partially visible. The silhouette of a Dravari dreadnought flickered, then duplicated itself in broken symmetry, its bow detached from real space by 6 degrees of drift. Portions of the warship appeared superimposed over its own structure, as if phasing in from conflicting arrival paths. Sparks flared against the aft plating, blown outward like metal rain from a crushed forge. The room held steady, but breath control devices activated in the ceiling as air pressure swayed slightly. Sympathetic reaction to gravitational interference, just outside the atmospheric boundary. They're overlapping each other, Rawl said, barely keeping his voice even. Sir, this shouldn't be possible. Fleet exit paths are staggered. Not in corrupted emergence, Kalvik said flatly. Not when the gravitational floor is fractured before the drop. The 5th dreadnought blinked into range and immediately ruptured along its central hull spine. A sound followed. Low but vibrating through the walls like thunder rolling inside steel walls. The ship didn't explode, it tore, unzipping as phase-incomplete layers competed to resolve the vessel's matter alignment. Fragments of the dorsal wings scattered, burning along friction boundaries generated by inconsistent gravity gradients. Internal fire suppression flickered on inside the drifting frame, but the systems were already behind reality. Jarek stepped up beside Kalvik, eyes fixed on the deteriorating feed. They stacked their jump vectors. Someone was rushing to get formation spacing minimized. This wasn't a tactical entry. It was a charge. They assumed we were evacuating, Kalvik answered. They thought speed guaranteed control. Not one of them asked whether arrival itself had been compromised. More ships followed. Smaller corvettes, missile frigates, strike escorts, all emerging into a broken navigational landscape. Some came through at incomplete angles, their gyroscopic aligners fighting non-existent terrain. One patrol carrier hit a rotational shear and spun end over end, launching atmosphere trails in a silent spiral. Another clipped the fractured shadow of a dreadnought's unresolved anchor field and lost all directional authority, sliding sideways through open space like a dying eel. No Earth vessel responded. None fired. No fleet appeared. There was only the field, silent, patient, and devastating. Inside the Dravari Command dreadnought, Sevrakar, Admiral Tyrek Grawl slammed both fists against the forward display. The image warbled, flickered, then realigned to show the status degradation of 5 lead ships. Get auxiliary stabilization online. Push the secondary emergence vectors outside the influence radius. His tactical officer spun from the rear panel, face pale. Auxiliary drives aren't responding. They're in partial transition lock. Systems think they're still mid-jump. Navigation can't correct without full reassertion of orientation vectors. Rawl turned, voice rising. We jumped. We arrived. The fleet is here. But the field isn't, the officer replied. Whatever they used, it didn't block us. It changed the landing zone. None of the reference points exist. We're calculating against imaginary coordinates. A warning chime erupted from below decks. 2 more destroyers began venting crew compartments. Structural hull stress reached critical threshold on the 6th dreadnought. The heat signatures rolled upward through every venting plate, as if the ship had been ignited from within. On the Sevrakar's bridge, Grawl dropped into his seat. His fingers clenched the armrests, face immobile. They didn't stop us, he said through his teeth. They rewrote the field so we'd stop ourselves. Back in Ardent Reach Command, Kalvik turned away from the live feed. They're still waiting for an enemy to arrive. They haven't realized they're already at war with physics. Jarek crossed his arms. They'll try to reposition, relay commands, fall back regroup. They can't, Kalvik interrupted. The lattice fields are still active in residual drift. Comms won't stabilize until they move out of the corrupted region, but if they do, he gestured toward the screen, they risk breaking formation even further. Any sudden departure could scatter their fleet across blind coordinates. Rawl looked over his shoulder. Sir, at what point do we announce contact? Kalvik's reply came without pause. We don't. Let them ask where we are. Let them start to wonder why no one's speaking. Jarek's jaw flexed. You think silence is more damaging than firepower? I think the absence of target information will destabilize them faster than any projectile. Kalvik walked toward the central node. They're soldiers. They expected friction. They prepared for losses. What they didn't prepare for was arriving with no opponent, no structure, and no certainty that their feet ever landed. The observation deck dimmed as another rupture flared across the outer perimeter. A final destroyer blinked into local space, barely intact, its stabilizers activated late, pitching the vessel sideways into the cold darkness beyond the anchor field. Lights flickered along its hull like a failed heartbeat. Then the ship began rotating, once, then twice, then continued spinning out of control. Inside the deep space dome above the carven wall, Vokar monitored the ship tracks as they twisted into unreadable spirals. He leaned closer to the interface and murmured to himself. This isn't battle. It's dismantling choreography. From orbit, Earth still hadn't fired, still hadn't shown a single vessel. Yet the Dravari formation, planned for impact, was disintegrating. Kalvik finally gave one nod. Old. No contact, no entry. Let them drown in their own arrival. And far above, inside fractured space, the fleet that had come too early learned what it meant to arrive in a war that had already ended. At 1907 standard, 37 minutes after the first corrupted Dravari dreadnought tore itself apart mid-reg, Earth's auxiliary fleet breached the carven wall. They emerged, not through drama, but through controlled symmetry. 12 ships peeling out of deep-range occlusion one at a time, staggered along pre-calculated vectors that navigated around every zone Earth's lattice interference had scarred into space. There were no display flares, no high-yield bursts. Each vessel completed its insertion silently, folding into stable position like blades sliding into unsheathed channels. Inside ECS Indentor, Kalvik stood at the forward viewport. The carven wall stretched behind them, jagged and folding inward with gravitational whiplash, but the field before him was even more arresting. He watched the Dravari fleet scatter beneath broken architecture, fragments drifting, thrusters flaring erratically, formation collapse visible across their ranks. One dreadnought rotated slowly, flames licking out from its internal structure, spilling escape pods that vanished into debris. "Status?" he asked, voice level but resolute. Jarek stepped beside him, reading from the ship-to-field overlay. 17 vessels unable to navigate, 5 immobilized, their command lattice is exposed. Central control still active, signal strength degraded. They're vulnerable. Kalvik gave a curt nod. "We don't need to crush them. We need to subtract their coordination." He pivoted to the left rail, where strike operator Bren Vask stood ready. Vask's hands hovered over the kinetic deployment interface. Rows of rail-guided projectiles lined the screen, each assigned a ship core, a subdeck, or a comm dish. Not one was marked for total hull penetration. "Designate all targets to command bridges and relay towers only," Kalvik instructed. "Everything else is off-grid, no reactor strikes, no life support, no engines. We're not killing a fleet, we're ending its function." Vask glanced up. "Target confirmation locked? Shall I initiate staggered volley or synchronized?" "Synchronized," Kalvik replied. "They won't have time to adapt if the timing's clean." The command chamber dropped into low alert. The walls dulled to a darker hue, indicating transition to weapons live status. Across 12 ships, kinetic rail batteries rotated and locked into alignment. Earth's forces hadn't engaged a single enemy yet. But this movement, controlled and silent, delivered a message louder than any broadcast. From orbit, the weapons fired. No explosive aftermath followed. There were no shockwaves or trailing detonations. Instead, the first strike arrived like a pin into the heart of the Dravari nerve center. One command ship buckled mid-keel, its relay tower snapped free, drifting sideways in a slow, dying spin. The second shot severed the dorsal plate from an escort cruiser, cutting its satellite uplink offline. The third shattered a comm tower mounted above a Dravari destroyer's bridge, breaking its sync feed with fleet command. 12 strikes landed in just under 9 seconds. Each one performed with surgical accuracy, each designed to segment, not obliterate. Inside the Sevricar, Admiral Grall's hands tore across his console in a desperate attempt to reroute control flow. Screens flickered without response. Audio feeds bled static, signals cut off in mid-command. His voice strained as he called out across the command bridge. "Backup channels, re-establish fleet link through emergency codes, push fallback vector initiations." His comm officer shouted back from the relay desk. "We're blind, Admiral. Encryption checksum is failing across all relay threads. Earth's targeting comms, not us." Another explosion rocked the frame distilletra, this time a shattering noise from aft panel 3. The auxiliary antennae had collapsed inward, sparked violently, then tore free from the hull entirely. Grall turned toward his executive officer. "How many ships have working navigation control?" "Unknown. We've lost verification tags from 4 sectors. Relay traffic is ghosting. Internal pings. Only return partial confirmations. We can't verify who's still combat active." Grall stepped away from the comm panel. His eyes flicked across the mangled telemetry. The attack was not designed to inflict mass casualty. It was cleaner than that. Surgical, indifferent. His hands curled into fists. "They're dismantling us," he muttered. Back aboard Indentor, Kalvik gave no expression of triumph. He turned from the viewport as the final kinetic strike took out the last intact central array. "Vask, confirm disengagement," Kalvik ordered. "Full fleet withdrawal. Jump paths are uploaded. Displace immediately. They won't chase." Jarek stepped forward, confusion furrowing his brow. "We're just leaving them?" "They came looking for war," Kalvik said without looking back. "But what they brought can't be used now. We didn't engage their might. We dismantled the framework that lets it function. He walked toward the navigation console and watched the hauler paths fade from the local map. Each had already exited into deep transit. Empty, expended, and quiet. The air hierarchy depends on structured cohesion, he continued. Remove their chain of contact, remove their operational synchrony, and their fleet becomes a scattering of scared ships trying to guess the next move. We don't punish, we disassemble. Jarek took in the field again. Ships spinning in disarray. No clear regroup, no clear orders. Only confusion. And if they recover? He asked. They won't, Kalvik answered, not soon, and not before they're forced to explain why the entire fleet collapsed without a single casualty report on our side. In the final moment before Indenter departed, Kalvik sent one last signal, not to the Dravari fleet, but to Earth's Strategic Council. A timestamp ledger. 13 confirmed kinetic strikes. 0 fatalities. Complete operational segment. The order closed with a single statement. Tactical contact complete. Opposition no longer structurally aligned. Then Earth vanished from the field, leaving behind a fleet fully intact, yet no longer capable of acting as one. Admiral Tyrak Grawl stared at the blank space where his fleet's command lattice should have been. The central array inside Severkar's warboard flickered between garbled ship IDs and looping error codes. Data packets failed to resolve. Real-time telemetry, once a living web of fleet interconnection, now resembled a scattered trail of disconnected pulses with no structure. Each returning query came corrupted, wrong checksum, displaced encryption headers, mismatched registry seeds. He turned slowly. Give me a hard relay to Tovek-class carrier Vernash. I want their field recon patched through the backup uplink. The comms officer's expression didn't change, though his shoulders locked with restrained frustration. The secondary bridge isn't responding. All fallback channels are returning false checksum flags. The authentication tree's been fractured, sir. We're receiving input from echo sources, but we can't verify if they're from us or something mimicking us. Grawl's jaw tensed. Repeat the request using legacy fleet code. Try the transmission module from before the Karnak Treaty integration. It loops back, came the flat response. The command pings return with valid routing numbers, but the origin paths don't exist anymore. It's like the grid is filled with ghosts. He didn't reply. He couldn't, not when the term felt closer to an operational truth than metaphor. Outside the viewport, several ships drifted without orientation. Some rotated slowly, carried by momentum rather than directive. Others remained immobile, systems likely frozen in sync recovery loops. Grawl had spent decades commanding through storms, betrayal, and orbital sieges, but this wasn't failure through resistance. This was paralysis engineered by someone who understood the gap between structure and symbol. The Severakar's deck creaked beneath his boots. It wasn't hull strain. It was the echo of compensator gyros attempting to readjust for gravitational contours that no longer matched the surrounding telemetry. Every course correction triggered recalibration. Every recalibration spiraled into another error. He moved toward the lower command tier, stepping past data officers scrambling to stabilize something, anything. Send a limited range alert to all remaining vessels. Tell them not to attempt FTL without static anchor confirmation. If they jump inside these drift bands, we'll be scraping half their decks out of folded space. A young navigator turned, voice brittle. Sir, several captains are initiating fallback maneuvers. They're trying to vector back to the Varnas Strip. They won't make it, Grawl snapped. That corridor is inside the residual echo shell. They'll emerge before their engines finish computation. They're not waiting for instructions. Because they can't hear instructions. He struck the side of the command rail. We were outmaneuvered before we fired a single shot. On the Dravari homeworld of Solvarin, a different storm brewed. The primary War Council chamber pulsed with ambient screens and cascading light columns. Counselor Var Endek paced tightly around the triad circle, a live feed of the Arden Reach incident flickering beside him. Each angle was worse than the last. Dravari dreadnoughts tumbling, formations undone, not a single Earth vessel visible. He pointed at the timestamp with a clawed finger. The order to strike was issued through Channel 5722. That vector doesn't carry full military consent. It bypasses consensus procedures. A second figure, Council Archivist Tren Mekloth, stepped forward with an encrypted ledger. Confirmation just came through. High Admiral Virik injected the order into the system using an override embedded in a ceremonial directive stream. It was camouflaged under the treaty verification band. Andek turned, expression twisted with disbelief. He forged War Declaration Protocol? Mekloth nodded once. He used it as a scaffold. The treaty compliance relay allowed limited executive access. From there, he masked the jump orders as procedural drills. Third voice cut in, this one calmer, more lethal. Supreme Evaluator Haran Dasal raised his gaze from a smaller display. We ran a systems trace. Earth's Strategic Council not only anticipated the strike, they tracked the illegal injection's signature. Antek's eyes narrowed. Which means they knew. They didn't just defend, they exposed us. And they never responded publicly, Dossel said. Not a single word. They let our ships fire blank. Then they let us choke on the chain of command we pretended to control. Mekloth stepped forward again. We've initiated recall on the second wave. Deployment has been suspended pending legal review. You think that matters now? Andek asked, voice brittle. Virik's maneuver wasn't just unauthorized, it was tactically annihilated without a battle. Earth didn't take territory, they unmade the authority behind our fleet. A quiet settled across the chamber, one born of comprehension, not silence. Back aboard Sevrakar, systems flickered once more. This time, it wasn't a fault, it was a transmission. A low-frequency packet, not broadcast, not repeated. It arrived with no encryption header, no demand, no attached speech. It simply contained two time indexes, the timestamp of the Dravari ultimatum and the timestamp of their fleet's emergence into Ardent Reach. Nothing else. Grawl stared at the numbers. They sent us a clock. The comms officer stepped closer, hesitant. Why show us the difference? Because that's all they needed? Grawl's voice dropped, nearly hoarse. That's the message. Not how they hit us. When. The bridge lights dimmed as energy protocols recalibrated again, failing to normalize. Across the broken field outside, Dravari vessels hung limp in space. Half were running silent, the rest looping internal diagnostics with no reliable output. Grawl raised his head and spoke to no one in particular. They didn't dismantle our ships. They dismantled a chain that gives ships their meaning. He turned, walking slowly toward the upper tier, boots trailing hollow echoes. No enemy in sight, no territory claimed, no fire exchanged in open terms, and yet here we are, waiting for instructions from a war council that no longer owns this war. Back on Solvern, Counselor Endek activated the public records freeze on the incident. The chamber's light dimmed. One by one, internal files began to lock behind review protocols, not to protect strategic integrity, but to bury the truth that Earth had never needed to fight for dominance, only to show who'd lost control of the countdown. And somewhere between that realization and the moment of silence that followed, an old rule fractured. The one that assumed time was neutral. Earth hadn't answered later. It had answered before the rest of them had even understood what question had been asked. The debris had not yet stopped drifting when Earth disappeared from Ardent Reach. No farewell transmission, no signal of disengagement, no ceremonial acknowledgement. The entire auxiliary fleet departed using encrypted jump sequences, routed through high obliquity corridors layered deep beneath gravitational noise fields. Within 47 minutes of the final kinetic strike, the region's Earth presence dropped to zero. Admiral Grawl, still trapped inside Sevrakar's half-operational bridge, didn't watch them leave, because there was nothing left to watch. No trace of Earth's vessels, no fading afterburn signatures. Even the passive tracking nodes his crew had deployed failed to register directional flux. It was as if they'd never entered the region at all. But the timestamp Earth had sent earlier still hovered on his cracked display. That, and the now frozen wreckage around him, remained the only proof a strike had occurred. He reviewed the packet for the 5th time. It hadn't been accompanied by demands. The data file wasn't layered with threats or protocol language. It simply contained 2 embedded system clocks, his own fleet's emergence timestamp and the original ultimatum Earth had received. 19 hours. No explanation, just the math. The implication didn't need an escort. From Silveron's Central Strategic Registry, the failure echoed louder than any intercepted transmission. Counselor Var Endek stood in the command chamber with a permanent line creased across his forehead. Every analyst stationed around him worked in silence, comparing navigational telemetry with the raw data Earth had so quietly dropped into their military servers. None dared speak first. They didn't answer the ultimatum, Endek said, eyes flicking to a recompiled vector map. They timed it. Evaluator Haran Dasal stepped forward, and in doing so, they proved they were monitoring our internal mobilizations before we finalized them ourselves. A third voice cut in from the Eastern Archive tier, Commander Lurs Vedik of the Diplomatic Risk Council. He tapped his knuckle against a projection panel, zooming into the frame showing Earth's earlier vessel movements. Their entry paths were routed through legacy diplomatic tunnels we abandoned 4 decades ago. They didn't forge new routes, they used our forgotten ones. Then they masked exit trails through gravity fault lines that only they appear to have mapped. Endek turned. You're saying they walked across our blind spot with a map we stopped using, and made sure we saw the footprint after it vanished, Vedik confirmed. Thousands of kilometers away, back on Earth, inside the Department of Celestial Navigation, an entirely different kind of operation unfolded. The chamber resembled no battlefield. Wood-paneled floors, dim light filtered through temperature-tuned skylights. The scent of paper, real paper, lingered among the binding machines and hand-marked charts. Director Arne Colvin sat beside a cylindrical table covered in old star maps, revised transparencies, and soft display overlays calibrated with drift field simulations. He adjusted a magnifier over a printed gravity wave record and tapped twice near a segment labeled Route 11A/Ardent Reach/Carvin Proximity Fault Line. Input the drift coefficient into the variable bands, he instructed quietly. Mark deviation margins with red line boundaries. Push that to the diplomatic version of the nav update. An assistant, barely out of training, hesitated. Sir, that will place red markers over 6 neutral trade corridors. Yeah? The assistant paused again. Those corridors aren't Earth-claimed space. That's not the point. Arne's tone remained calm, but final. They'll receive these charts as part of the quarterly updates. Nothing alarming, just recommended avoidance due to local gravitational irregularities. Non-hostile, non-political. The assistant nodded and stepped back. Arne turned toward the main wall and reviewed a set of blinking indicators from the External Adjustment Group. Each represented a regional correction Earth's Fleet Command had inserted into trade lane data. To the average navigator, these appeared as advisory cautions, but every line they altered corresponded directly to vectors Earth could collapse without combat. Every drift warning embedded in those charts marked a threshold Earth had already proven could fracture arrivals. Across the system, traders would receive the updated maps. Governments would install them into routing software. Militaries would review them. But no one would accuse Earth of aggression. The data would pass quietly through bureaucracies. No fanfare, no broadcast, just silent control layered inside trustable information. On Silveran, Endek reviewed one of those exact charts. It had come in just hours before from the Interstellar Advisory Board. An automatic update, routine by all appearances. He held it up beside the footage of the broken Dravari fleet. One of the corridors flagged under gravitational uncertainty was the same vector Vyrix battle group had used. That path was not marked before the incident. "Do you see this?" he asked quietly. Docile, standing beside him, studied the chart. They rewrote the narrative without a single word. Endek sat slowly. "And now, every trading partner, every observer, will carry this version of events. One where Earth never escalated, one where Earth never responded, one where they simply left behind proof that the strike happened long before we knew the countdown had even mattered." Dosal exhaled, then dropped a datapad onto the table. "We filed a review report on the first packet Earth sent. Our servers traced it to a diplomatic path that predates our current encryption protocol. That channel was archived after the Orion-Herethia Accord. That route hasn't been touched in 70 years. And they kept it?" Indek muttered. "No," Dacel corrected. "They kept all of them." Inside Earth's Strategic Council chamber, the atmosphere remained calm. Kelvik stood at the far window, arms behind his back, watching the updated flight patterns dance across the ceiling's projection dome. A quiet series of pings marked civilian vessels integrating the newly issued navigational cautions into their outbound drives. Director Maris leaned against the command rail. "No response from the hegemony yet?" Kelvik nodded. "We didn't give them an opening." Jarek, reviewing real-time drift field models, looked up. "What happens if they try to reassert presence?" Kelvik turned, voice even. "They'll be tracked on charts they now think are broken. They'll hesitate at every entry point. They'll distrust every corridor we've flagged. Our control now isn't just military, it's infrastructural." Maris raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the field isn't the weapon?" Kelvik shook his head. "The implication is," and as the charts finalized across every border, the new reality set in. Earth hadn't claimed territory. It had redrawn the meaning of arrival. Inside the Terran Strategic Archive, silence was not enforced. It was chosen. Senior command observers stood in a tiered amphitheater, their eyes fixed on the simulation feed rotating across the transparent ceiling. Dozens of system replay logs traced Dravari jump vectors, lattice disruptions, and the subsequent collapse of formation integrity, all displayed without commentary. The simulation didn't exaggerate, it didn't dramatize, it simply showed a fleet disassembled without engagement. In the center of the floor stood Voss Denhall, a neutral evaluator appointed by the Interstellar Defense Concord. He adjusted his collar once, then spoke into the room with the same steady tone he'd used when dissecting dozens of conflict doctrines over the past 40 years. "The Earth response during the Ardent Reach incursion has permanently altered conventional threat calculus, not through volume, not through firepower, but by the eradication of expected sequences." He let that settle. A fleet was dismantled, yet no kill orders were issued. A region was neutralized, yet no claim was made. A coup was revealed, yet no broadcast followed. A whisper of discomfort passed among the outer ring of seated analysts. These were not students. They were military auditors, fleet instructors, defense treaty architects. None of them asked questions. Each had already reviewed the raw data. They weren't here for clarification. They were here to absorb the consequences of what Earth had not done. Denhall continued. "Traditional warfare as we've known it assumes confrontation is reactive. Threats arise, forces applied, cycles of retaliation occur. Earth has demonstrated that timeline manipulation, combined with protocol erosion, can bypass escalation entirely. They didn't counter the attack. They removed its spine." He tapped his index finger against the interactive pad. Dozens of timeline maps collapsed, rearranged, and displayed a before and after schema of the Ardent Reach corridor. In military terms, Earth didn't conduct a defensive operation. They conducted an operational veto, preemptively disabling the structural authority of an opponent by removing the timeline in which their control could stabilize. The room didn't applaud. No one spoke. That silence, however, wasn't stillness. It was internal recalibration. In the Glavari Federation's Central Defense Complex, Admiral Treff Soren closed his eyes as the final Ardent Reach overlay dimmed on the room-wide display wall. He leaned forward in his seat, pressing his fingers into his temples. "They didn't win by surviving," he said. "They won by making the other side arrive into dysfunction." Strategic Advisor Kel Cern crossed his arms. "We always modeled Earth's capabilities by their response time. Reaction speed, counter-deployment strength, supply endurance." Soren opened his eyes. "We measured the wrong variable." Cern looked at the chart again. "And if we updated our own field arrival plans to avoid the same lattice interference?" Durand exhaled sharply. "We wouldn't know where they'd buried the next collapse." "That's the issue. Earth didn't make a mistake. They made a doctrine." A few meters away, a fleet simulator drone ran another trial, this one adjusted with false assumptions removed. Even then, 63% of simulated fleets still fractured on approach. Cern frowned. "We're not fighting ships anymore. We're fighting the fact that Earth now owns the setup." In a deep hall within the Varro Confederacy's War College, 5 senior tacticians reviewed the Earth maps now circulating among neutral trading partners. At first glance, the documents looked ordinary. Gravitational advisories, drift threshold corrections, mass recalibration zones. But each one now matched pathways tied to Earth's observed manipulation zones. The implications were impossible to ignore. "Why hasn't Earth claimed any of this?" asked General Vecthaler, knuckles pressing into the edge of the projector table. "They don't have to," said strategic analyst Drin Voller. "They didn't build these zones to hold ground. They built them to erase attack windows." A younger officer, listening from the outer row, spoke up cautiously. "What happens if we try to bypass the advisory charts?" Thaler glanced at him. "Then you tell your fleet captains. They'll be the ones to find out what wasn't listed." Back on Earth, Calgic stood alone inside a private debrief room beneath the Defense Ministry's central chamber. He hadn't spoken since arrival. Several officials waited on the other side of a two-way divider, watching as he paced once, then stopped near the recessed light panel built into the floor. A low chime echoed, signaling the beginning of the inquiry. "Commander Thorn Calvic," came the moderated voice of the lead council speaker. "You are hereby requested to provide official statement on the events in Ardent Reach and the doctrine now associated with Earth's deterrent methodology." Calvig said nothing at first. His hands rested behind his back. He looked forward, unblinking, then stepped into the center of the panel ring. "We're not fast," he said evenly. The observers leaned closer. "We're prepared." And that was all he gave them. Days later, across political cores and remote outposts alike, the galaxy's attention drifted less toward Earth's fleet strength and more toward the absence of escalation. Military symposia adjusted their simulation protocols. New curriculum emerged inside officer academies. Risk models no longer focused on Earth's ability to counter strikes. Instead, lectures examined how Earth invalidated structural causality. The question shifted from, "Can they hold the line?" to, "Where did they put the switch?" On Solvarin, the Dravari War Council remained in deadlock. Admiral Vyric's name had been scrubbed from active service records. The incident logs were sealed behind internal consensus protocols that required 3 signatures, none of which had been given. Counselor Andek stood at the far end of the Judiciary Hall, watching the legal clerks argue over whether the event could be classified as war. "There was no declaration," one said. "There was no reply," added another. "But something happened," murmured the clerk chief. Andek didn't move. "That's what makes it worse." In the final week of system-wide review, the Interstellar Doctrine Archive received a recommendation packet from Vostin Hall. It was simple, short, factual, and dangerous. At its center was a single doctrine clause for inclusion. Earth's engagement model is not reactive. It is architectural negation. Conflict cannot escalate if the floor beneath it dissolves. And for the first time in 3 generations, war theorists agreed. Earth had done something worse than win. They'd done less on purpose, and redefined what power looked like when it arrived before the countdown was even noticed. The strategic overlay of ardent reach faded into grayscale as the final diplomatic report rendered its conclusion. The corridor remained untouched. No nation had staked a claim. No defense grid now orbited the zone. Yet anyone who looked at the updated star charts would see the warning. A faint icon beside every approach vector, labeled not with a flag or fleet designation, but a short advisory. Caution during emergent transit. No one asked what it meant. No one challenged the accuracy. Ships adjusted their courses long before reaching the threshold. Convoys drifted kilometers off the original lanes. Fleet commanders rerouted drills away from the corridor entirely. No patrols were dispatched to test it. No probes entered to verify the distortion data. The entire region, left physically unscarred, now existed as a deterrent born from what was never publicly claimed. Inside Earth's strategic reserve, Commander Thorn Kalvik sat in a windowless chamber lit only by a recessed panel casting white across the embedded display. He wore no formal insignia. The markings had already been stripped from his uniform following the final debrief. No court, no citation, just silence. Appropriate for a man who had led Earth's most consequential operation without issuing a single broadcast. He leaned forward and touched the center of the interface. The audio played again. This is the official directive of the Dravari hegemony. You are ordered to evacuate all Earth-lined assets from Ardent Reach within 72 hours. He stopped the feed before it finished. Then he replayed the second timestamp Earth had sent in response. It displayed the confirmed arrival logs of the Dravari fleet, 19 hours after the ultimatum was issued. Kalvik sat still, hands pressed together beneath his chin, elbows on the desk. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. The footage rolled on, switching now to raw surveillance captured by Earth's remote observation grid. Dravari dreadnoughts emerging into unstable gravitational seams, their ships twisting mid-middleization, their formations unraveling before a single threat ever appeared. He watched one vessel spin sideways as its thrusters sputtered. He tracked the moment when 3 carriers failed to sync re-entry coordinates. His eyes lingered on a destroyer rupturing under its own conflict between anchor values. Behind him, the door unlocked with a single click. Jarek stepped in, carrying a sealed archive case under one arm. He didn't say anything for the first few seconds. "They're calling it the silent fracture," he said at last. "Even in simulation updates, no one uses assault anymore. It's a collapse model now." Kalvik didn't look away. "What does the Council want to do with the corridor?" "Leave it untouched. Declare it neutral indefinitely." Jarek placed the archive case gently on the side table. "They figure it's safer that way. Safer to let the region speak for itself." Kalvik shut the display. "It already has." Jarek walked over, crossed his arms, and studied his commanding officer's profile. "You didn't win with firepower. You won with subtraction." Kalvik shook his head. "I didn't win. They lost control of a timeline they didn't understand. And you made sure everyone saw them lose it." "They didn't just lose a battle," Kalvik said, turning now. "They lost their ability to schedule one." Jarek exhaled, voice low. "It's spreading." Kalvik raised an eyebrow. Jarek continued. 3 minor factions just issued corridor neutrality notices. The Elkar Dominion withdrew from a trade lane dispute, and the Euroleam Senate issued an internal memo. Tactical manuals are being rewritten. Every scenario now factors in one variable they never included before. Kalvik stood. His joints ached, but he moved with that same calm rhythm, measured, deliberate. "What's the variable?" Jarek answered without hesitation. "Preemptive collapse modeling. They're not asking how to win anymore. They're asking how to survive a war that ends before it starts. Kalvik crossed to the wall console. The light from the ceiling dimmed as he pulled up one final data slice, an internal report from Earth's diplomatic sector. A list of star systems with flagged corridor conditions. Half were marked with updated gravitational readings. The other half carried subtle discrepancies no one questioned. "Any response from Silveron?" he asked. "They denied authorization," Jarek replied. "Their official stance is procedural sabotage, but the War Council's chain audit was leaked. They're fractured. Nothing's getting through." "Good," Kalvik said. "Let them fixate on the gap. That's where their fear lives now." Jarek moved toward the door but paused before leaving. "We're not going to claim anything, are we?" Kalvik didn't look at him. "We don't need to." The door slid closed behind Jarek, leaving the commander alone again. Across the galaxy, in a sealed chamber beneath the Galactic Council's central archive, a clerk filed the final update to the diplomatic doctrine revision. It was a short edition, 3 lines appended to a chapter on escalation modeling. No announcement, no summary, just 3 sentences, ratified by silent vote and entered into permanent record. Do not measure Earth by reaction time. Do not model Earth by readiness states. Do not assume Earth needs time. Their doctrine erases time. Kalvik leaned back into his chair. The room's light cooled. He pulled up the raw logs from the first sensor capture. When the Dravari fleet emerged 24 minutes earlier than even Earth's own worst-case prediction, they thought they'd move too fast. They thought Earth would scramble. They didn't realize Earth had already made its move hours before anyone hit deploy. Kalvik closed the report and shut down the panel. He said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. They issued an ultimatum. Earth answered before the hourglass cracked.